Yes, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar, Relations with China in 2024, Challenges and Perspectives with Susan Thornton. I'm Joe Brzezinski, and I'm the director of the China Center. Thank you for your joining us today, and thank you for your support of the China Center in this webinar series. Special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program, and I invite you to help us advance our mission by giving to the China Center through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. Please submit your questions that you may have throughout this program through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the program. So let's get started. Our speaker today, Susan A. Thornton, is a former career U.S. diplomat who has served as acting assistant secretary for the state East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2017 and 18. She's currently a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and senior fellow at the law school's Paul Tsai China Center. She's also the director on the Forum of Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. 2024 can bring us some new turbulence in the U.S. China relationship, from presidential elections in Taiwan to the continued U.S. China trade fights and chip wars, and also to the uncertainty of the U.S. presidential elections. China's own domestic woes, from deflation and population decline and youth unemployment, also present a number of uncertainties that will complicate our relationships. Susan, looking forward to hearing about your opinions on these challenges and what you think our prospects are. So welcome, Susan. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Joan, and thanks so much to the University of Minnesota for having me. I had a great trip to Minnesota earlier this year to speak to a group in person, and I'm happy to be back with you, and to be back with you just on the heels of a trip of my own to Beijing last week, where I was able to meet with a bunch of Chinese officials and academics and experts. So I'll try to reflect a little bit of that in my discussion today. Of course, this talk is about prospects for U.S. China relations in the coming year. And I think as we go into this year, the watchword I've heard from so many people is kind of uncertainty. We have the Ukraine war still going on. We had the outbreak of war, unfortunately, in the Middle East in October, and that's still taking a very uncertain trajectory and continuing. And then we have, of course, as Joan mentioned, at the end of this year, the U.S. presidential election, and we have elections in many, many countries around the world this year. And of course, one of those elections will come up in our discussion today, which is the recent election in Taiwan. But I think uncertainty has really been a feeling that we've been living with since the outbreak of COVID-19 4 years ago. And, as we get into this next year of uncertainty, it's my view, and I'll give you here the bottom line up front for my talk, it's my view that actually U.S. China relations in 2024 will be a kind of a bright spot, paradoxically, in terms of uncertainty in 2024. I actually think that the uncertainty in U.S. China relations that we've seen in the last few years is going to be somewhat more predictable and stabilized in this coming year. I won't go with predictions beyond this coming year, as there are a lot of question marks still ahead, but I think for this coming year, we should see things fairly, if not on a very upbeat and positive note, at least stable. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that and why I come to that conclusion. But first, let me talk a little bit about how we came to where we are today, because I think it's important for level setting and also just to have a common picture, or at least for you to have sort of my picture on how U.S. China has come to be where it is today. I think we all realize there's been a very rapid deterioration in U.S.-China relations in the last several years. There are always, of course, differences between the U.S. and the Chinese governments. And the recent dip, though, I think did really begin in the end of 2017 when the U.S. government in the Trump administration identified China as the U.S.'s major threat and a strategic competitor. And then in the beginning of 2018, immediately after that, we had the launch of the so-called trade war with the levying of tariffs on across the board on Chinese imports into the U.S. And I think this was quickly followed, in 2018, 2019 by skirmishes over technology. We had the particular case of the ban on, China's national champion telecom company, Huawei. And that was a kind of an indication of where things were headed. And then there was a lot of talk of sort of decoupling the two economies that followed. But we did see the negotiation of the phase one trade deal early in 2020. And in fact, the phase one trade deal, which had been negotiated for almost 2 years then by the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in the Trump administration, that was signed on January 20th, 2020, just 3 days before the city of Wuhan in China was locked down because of COVID-19. So there was a lot of fanfare around this phase one trade deal, and it looked at that point, very briefly, like we would be making some progress with China. Then, of course, with the pandemic raging toward the U.S. and many, many cases of COVID-19 in the U.S. by March, we saw basically the shutdown of U.S.-China relations at that point. There were all these frenzied efforts by both governments, actually, with respect to COVID-19, a lot of blaming back and forth over failings related to handling that outbreak. And relations with China really went into a tailspin after that in the spring of 2020, certainly until the end of that year. And of course, this was made worse by domestic politics in both countries as the U.S. had a presidential election at the end of that year. So, after that, as a result, for more than 3 years, basically U.S.-China contacts came to a halt and communication between the two was virtually absent. There was, a lot of talk during this period about U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. We had many, many headlines in the U.S. and many, many officials and top military personnel talking about the potential for conflict in the Taiwan Strait, et cetera. And, U.S.-China trade did continue in this period, and it even grew. But the effects of the hiatus in communication were really deeply negative for relations, and especially coming on the heels of this market downturn in relations that sowed a lot of mistrust. It was really difficult to try to do anything that could be seen as positive. And each side tended to assume the worst of the other side in this period, so that small things that happened were magnified into big things. And when the Biden team came in, they inherited this state of affairs. Also, they inherited, of course, COVID-19 and the cutoff of communication. The Biden team continued the tariffs on China and other measures aimed at the Chinese tech companies. And we saw tensions really spike in the wake of House of Representatives Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in the summer of 2022. When that happened, the reaction on the part of Beijing was quite severe, both in terms of military responses around Taiwan, but also in terms of cutting off all of the communications that had started to be reestablished between the U.S. and China. And at that point, the relationship appeared to sort of be on the verge of a collapse. But fortunately, both sides sort of realized that tensions were getting out of hand, and they did manage to arrange a leader level meeting that year after the Pelosi visit in Bali, Indonesia. And at that meeting, they set out a series of commitments that they would try to make in terms of reconnecting the two governments in having some forms of communication and talks. Unfortunately, those agreements were sort of sidelined by the eruption of another crisis, which was brought on by the spy balloon incident in early 2023. And that derailed Secretary of State Tony Blinken's visit to China, which was to have been followed by a number of other visits. And relations, again, sort of spiraled into mutual recriminations, and there were absolutely no communications, no channels working at that point. And I think at that point, what we saw happen was a lot of countries, especially in Asia, partners of the U.S., but also countries in other parts of the globe, expressing to both the U.S. and China their concerns about how they perceived the U.S. and China to be mismanaging their relationship, and that it was causing ripple effects for them and causing concerns on their part, and that they hoped that the U.S. and China would find a way to better manage their relationship. And so I think that really did serve to bring the two sides together to realize that the repeated sort of cycles of escalation were very harmful. And at that point, they did, decide that they should try to stabilize things between the two countries. So at that point, in the second half of last year, 2023, they finally did manage to set in motion some of the agreements and some of the meetings that the two leaders had agreed to in Bali at the end of 2022. They started with the visit of Secretary of State Tony Blinken to Beijing. And then there were a number of additional meetings. The Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of the Treasury both visited Beijing, Janet Yellen and Gina Raimondo. The Chinese Minister of Commerce came to the U.S. We had the Foreign Policy Director and Foreign Minister Wang Yi also came to the U.S. And finally, at the end of last year, Xi Jinping did make the decision to travel to San Francisco to meet with President Biden in person for a summit meeting. And that was sort of the indication that both sides had decided that, I think the Biden administration had decided that they had to demonstrate that they could manage the competition with China responsibly, and that was something that politically would not be a liability, but would be an asset. And then for their part, on the Chinese government's part, Xi Jinping was, of course, grappling with, at that point, a botched opening from COVID-19 and a very sluggish economy. And I think both sides decided that they had enough problems without adding to the plate increasing tensions in U.S. China relations, and that stabilization was in their own self-interest. It didn't hurt that it was also something that many others in the world had indicated they were hoping to see. And so this meeting in San Francisco, of course, um, had led to a series of meetings, and I think few people expected to see positive outcomes from this San Francisco summit meeting between the two presidents. But actually, I think it was quite surprising that we did see several specific areas of cooperation emerge from that meeting. First of all, there was an agreement on cooperation to stem the flow of precursor chemicals that would lead to the synthesis of fentanyl in foreign countries, and then see that flowing into the United States to contribute to our opioid addiction problem. This is something that the U.S. has been working on with China for years prior to this meeting, and in fact had some agreements on previous to that during the Trump administration. But unfortunately, the narcotics cartels had found workarounds to those earlier restrictions that had been put in place, and so we needed to make new steps to put in more restrictions. So the U.S. and China came to an agreement that they would do that, and we've already seen some actions taking place on the part of China, and there will be a follow-up meeting of the counter-narcotics working group between the U.S. and China. There'll be a U.S. high-level delegation at the vice cabinet secretary level traveling to Beijing to work on these issues in the near future. Another outcome of this summit meeting was an agreement, another statement on cooperation to stem climate change, which was actually quite important in the lead up to the COP28 in Dubai. And it was sort of the last major joint effort between our two veteran climate change envoys. Of course, John Kerry for the U.S. side and Xie Zhenhua for the Chinese side. The two of them had been working together for the previous several years, and of course had worked together previously in the Obama administration on these issues. And so it was very significant, I think, that they were able to come up with this so-called Sunnylands Declaration. They had a meeting before the summit in California where they set out a whole bunch of areas to work on in climate change cooperation. Both of these envoys have since stepped down from their positions, and so there are new people that are going to be taking up this effort. But I think the declaration was significant. The maybe most noted kind of cooperation that came out of this summit meeting was the reestablishment of U.S. China military to military ties and discussions. These military to military discussions between the U.S. and China tend to be sort of the first thing to go when tensions arise between the two countries. And it was definitely felt very strongly by the U.S. side that given the high levels of tension, especially in and around the Taiwan Strait, that it was very important to have military contacts to try to head off any kind of accidental incident that would lead potentially to escalation and conflict. And so the reestablishment of these military channels is very important. And not only did they reestablish military channels, but they opened a new channel between the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Chinese counterpart in the Central Military Commission. And that's a very operational channel. It's very high level, and it's something that the U.S. had long sought and was frustrated that it was unable to get opened. So that is definitely a major development, and one that we hope can keep going and not be shut down at the first hint of some kind of tension in the Taiwan Strait. And then there were several other things that came from the summit meeting, but one that's very important as an indicator of trust building was that the two sides agreed to start a dialogue on the regulation of artificial intelligence. Of course, the U.S. and China are the two leaders in the development of artificial intelligence, and it's an area that's been described by the U.S. government as a major area for this strategic competition that's been declared between the U.S. and China, and it's at the heart of the U.S. efforts to curb semiconductor exports, advanced semiconductor exports to China. So the fact that the two sides nevertheless were able to agree to have a high-level dialogue on the dangers of AI and the need to regulate AI, particularly in the military area, is significant. My understanding is that they're still working out the shape of the table for that discussion and who's going to be participating. It's extremely difficult to orchestrate that kind of a meeting and get the necessary specific expertise along with the diplomatic experience needed to put together a productive meeting on something that contentious and that technical. But I think that will happen over the next several months. The other important thing that came from this meeting was that there was a decision very conscientiously made to try to reconnect our two societies. So one of the things that happened after COVID was that the number of flights between the U.S. and China went from 350 a week down to basically zero. I think in the recent period, we had maybe 12 direct flights a week. And now we're back up to 70 direct flights a week and moving toward more than 100 flights a week in the coming months. But reestablishing those air connections is extremely important to facilitate the movement of people back and forth. Business people have been having a very hard time getting back into China. Students and student exchanges have fallen way off, especially American students going to China to study. And people-to-people tourist exchanges, because of the expense of the flights and the difficulties of travel, had fallen also way off, in addition to COVID restrictions being a big inhibitor. So reconnecting the two societies has been a priority, and trying to make visas more readily available and simplify that process has been a big part of the discussion. And also one of the major areas of effort in the coming months is going to be to try to, reevaluate the things like the travel advisories that are in place from both sides about traveling to the other, and some of the other obstacles to easy travel back and forth, to try to get those sort of societal contacts back in gear. So with all that as background, let me talk for a few minutes on why I say that the coming year should be maybe a little bit more of an island of stability than some of the other areas in the world that we're currently seeing. Of course, the continued kind of stability in the U.S.-China relationship is going to depend on the determination of both of these two parties to continue to have these meetings and to continue to manage carefully what is an extremely complicated and sometimes fraught relationship. In 2024, we have a U.S. presidential campaign in which China appears to be a hot topic. So, to some extent, this stabilization is going to be maybe a bit difficult to continue. But it appears from what we've seen so far that, at least on the part of the two governments, that they are pretty determined to keep their communications and their meetings on track, and that the plans for continuing those meetings have been firmly laid down already. They've had already 2 meetings of various channels in the military to military sphere. We've seen the working groups from Homeland Security, from the Agriculture Department, the Commerce Department, and the Treasury Department have all been meeting. There was a working group from the Treasury Department working on macroeconomic stability, inflation, interest rates, debt issues that traveled to China last week and met with the People's Bank of China and the Ministry of Finance. So it's very good to see these kinds of specific meetings happening, and these talk about technical issues and how to make progress on some of these issues is very good for the stabilization in relations, and also just getting to know your counterpart in the other country is extremely important for stability. Maybe the most important thing that's happened to indicate that there will be some stability going forward is that the Taiwan election has actually already taken place. The candidate from the Democratic Progressive Party, William Lai Ching-te, who was the sitting vice president in the current administration in Taiwan, did win the election. That was not the outcome that the government in Beijing hoped to see, to say the least. But the responses to his being elected were quite, I would say, restrained on all parts. I would say that William Lai's victory speech was quite restrained, probably in comparison to what Beijing was worried he might say. And he even offered a kind of an olive branch in saying that he hoped to see more exchanges across the Taiwan Strait as part of his plans for his administration. So I think that was slightly unexpected, but he was certainly careful to try not to say anything that would be provocative in his speech right after the election. Of course, the inauguration in Taiwan doesn't happen until May. It's a very long transition period. So he is still the sitting vice president and has, Tsai Ing-wen is still the leader of Taiwan. So there is now time and scope for he and the mainland to try to establish some kind of back channel communications to try to feel out whether there can be more stability in the relationship than was anticipated during his administration. I don't think we should count on that, but at least there is the prospect of doing that. I think Beijing's response in their statements upon his victory were fairly restrained. They noted that he only got 40% of the votes, and they took that as a sign of kind of majority support for keeping open the options for cross-strait relations to improve. And of course, it's also the case that the legislature in Taiwan went to the opposition. So that's also something that should have made Beijing feel somewhat comforted in the face of the victory, nonetheless, of the Democratic Progressive Party candidate. So there was, of course, some response from Beijing on the part, in terms of the switching of a diplomatic ally, Nauru, from the Taiwan to the Beijing camp in terms of diplomatic recognition, and there was some military displays, and there may be some other signaling that goes on to try to warn William Lai against any provocative moves. But all in all, I think the rhetoric on all sides after the Taiwan election was fairly muted. And that includes from Washington. I think the sending of a delegation of former officials and the statements that came from Washington after the Taiwan election were all fairly within precedent and planned out carefully, and should indicate to Beijing that the Biden administration intends to continue with this approach towards stabilizing things over the coming year. We're likely to see a visit by Janet Yellen to Beijing next month, and we're likely to see the continuation of meetings and a high-level channel between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his counterpart in China, Wang Yi. And that channel appears to also be something that has been sort of committed to by both sides as an important way to manage sensitive issues in the relationship and keep things on track. Of course, it is very reasonable to wonder whether or not a fairly small thing like a spy balloon or a congressional visit to Taiwan will end up derailing things this year, as has happened in the recent past. And it is valid to wonder if in an election year we won't see so much volatile rhetoric that things will be easily derailed. And of course, it's always possible that something unexpected can arise, but I am still relatively optimistic about stability this year. I think the politics in both countries have accepted that stability in U.S. China relations is necessary and positive. In other words, investing in the stable relationship no longer appears to be as much of a political liability in China or in the U.S. as has been the case in the last couple of years, or at least perceived to be in the last couple of years. I think, there was very little criticism of President Biden's summit meeting of Xi Jinping. In previous years, there was a feeling or a strain of thought in Washington that, we shouldn't be meeting with the Chinese, they should be isolated, that communicating with China was indicating weakness. I think that criticism, in light of the tensions that have erupted a couple of times in the last couple of years, I think that the criticism of talking to China has pretty much not stuck, and the implied predictability that meetings telegraph has been welcomed, not just by people in the U.S., but really by many people, many countries around the world. So I think that has given the Biden administration confidence in pursuing and committing to continued talking with and meeting with China, at least. Now, I mean, there are many questions to be asked about these meetings. I think it was Winston Churchill that said it's better to talk jaw than war. So talking is better than fighting, for sure. Some people have characterized the U.S.-China relationship at this point as talking while fighting. But I think in general, talking is certainly an important way of stabilizing relations between two countries that have such different systems and have so many differences between them. Can the talking lead to some progress on some issues? I mean, I think that will be difficult this year, but it is possible that in some specific areas we'll see some progress. We'll have to see on that. I think there are risks of small crises, and I would characterize some of those. Certainly, tensions with the Philippines in the South China Sea has come up a number of times, and that appears like it will continue. But I do think that that situation can be managed in the end. It may create a small crisis, but I think in the end it will be controlled. There might be frictions over Taiwan, but as I've indicated, I think those should be manageable. Disagreements over the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East are probably not going to cause a crisis, but those frictions will probably continue. And of course, the economic tensions. Joan mentioned the chip wars, I mentioned the continuing efforts on export controls and other sanctions, blacklists for various companies and individuals in China. and then the Chinese retaliatory actions against those measures. We really don't know at this point how much more there will be this year in terms of the technology curbs coming from the U.S. and if there are any other kind of big actions waiting in the wings. There are some details to come out on outbound investment restrictions to China, which people are waiting for. So there may be more in the economic space, but I do think that the Biden administration this year is not going to look to see major disruptions in the U.S. China economic relationship. And certainly that's not going to be in China's interest. They're looking to try to pull their economy out of the current slump. So we may see some anti-China moves in Congress and elsewhere, but overall, I think they won't lead to a major crisis in relations this year. I think that we'll be working very hard to try to control those. And so I think maybe, Joan, if it's okay with you, I'll stop there and we'll see if we can answer some of the questions from the audience. Hopefully I've spurred some questions from people.
Sure. We've got a question off the bat here is how might access to social media in both countries help or hinder the U.S.-China relations?
Access to social media, yeah. So I mentioned that I was just in Beijing for a week, and this issue came up in almost every meeting. And I think the change in the media environment has definitely affected not just U.S.-China relations, it's affected politics in almost every country, and it's affected the way we conduct foreign relations around the globe. Certainly, the Chinese government feels pressure from netizens on social media in China. They were talking frequently about various issues that had attracted the eyeballs and the comments from, hundreds of millions of people on the Chinese internet and the pressure that that brought on the Chinese government. They also talked about sort of the effects of, the Twitterverse on U.S.-China relations and how critical, the commentary tends to be and how it sort of exacerbates any tension in the relationship gets kind of hyped up and blown out of proportion, and then it makes it more difficult for people to handle. So I think, it is a definite concern in the U.S.-China relationship, maybe in particular. There's also an asymmetry in dealing with problems in the U.S.-China relationship. The U.S. government and institutions feel immediate media pressure whenever anything arises. And the Chinese government tends to shut down in the face of a problem that arises and doesn't engage with the media. And so, there's just an asymmetry in the level of urgency that we feel. I think we saw this in the spy balloon incident, where actually now we know, because there have been reports and a lot more information has come out, that the U.S. government didn't see the spy balloon as actually a threat to U.S. national security, and their plan was to just let it float over the United States and watch it and gather information about it. But because it was discovered and then it was, publicized in the media, the whole thing took a completely different direction and became a huge incident in the relationship. So that's an example of how the best laid plans of government can be kind of disrupted by sort of the publication of what's going on. And we see also now, I mean, it's just very hard to do anything in kind of a private channel. I think that's why this channel between Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan is so important, because they're actually able to meet away from the glare of the cameras and have discussions on sensitive issues that really can only be had, away from the light of public scrutiny. So, I mean, I think that that is a real improvement and a real impetus to stabilization for this coming year.
Do you see any sign or evidence of forces outside of the current Chinese administration and the U.S. administration that may be attempting to influence the U.S. China relationship in one way or another?
Oh, yes, I think there are a lot. I mean, I think everyone in the world is interested in the US China relationship, and some are interested in seeing it be better, and some are interested in seeing it be worse, or some are interested in seeing it, in a certain area move in some direction or another that's in their interest. So I think this relationship actually impacts every country. And as I indicated in my remarks, many of those countries have been, talking to the U.S. and to China about the need to kind of stabilize the relationship, that the unpredictability of it was causing them problems. So I think you have that outside pressure. I mean, you've also got, different countries that have lined up sort of with China and with the U.S. and have various interests with respect to both the US and China. I mean, we talk a lot about how countries, especially in Asia, don't want to have to pick sides or choose between China and the US. And that's because they have extremely important and complicated relationships with both of them. I mean, China is the #1 trading partner for many, many countries in the world. I think over 120 now, and all of the countries in Asia, it's the #1 trading partner, these are very important relationships for the economies in the region. But they also have very important relations with the US as an investor, as a security guarantor, et cetera. And so, they're really looking to try to balance. They don't want to get caught in the middle of a U.S. China confrontation or conflagration. But the U.S. is pressing its partners to join it in sanctions regimes and export control regimes and other things directed at China. And that takes an awful lot of hard work, and a lot of countries are not so enthusiastic about joining in all aspects of U.S. policy toward China. So I think that makes it also very complicated for the U.S. government to consider what it should be doing with respect to China. And it's worth noting that these economic measures that are directed at China to try to keep it from getting certain kinds of technology are only effective, actually, if everyone else joins in. I mean, the way the global economy works, if you don't have a pretty comprehensive agreement on a sanctions regime, it's just very easy for things to make their way around, a unilateral sanctions regime. So it's actually really important that the U.S. Be able to have, a lot of solidarity around whatever measures it takes with respect to the Chinese economy. And I think that's another reason why this year we're probably going to see a much kind of slower rollout and a more targeted rollout of these kinds of measures at the Chinese economy, because I think the rest of the world and U.S. partners are becoming a little bit leery of having the sort of measures directed at the Chinese economy be too broad and too sweeping, and the U.S. government is hearing that from them.
What are your thoughts on the future of scientific collaboration between the U.S. and China scientists and researchers?
Yeah, that is a great question. I teach at Yale University, and we have extensive cooperation with Chinese counterparts, both at the Yale Hospital and medical establishment. In fact, Yale set up a hospital, one of the early hospitals in China in Changsha, in Hunan province. And so we have exchange researchers coming from Hunan province every year to the Yale University hospital system. And in our department of, quantum computing, we have so many really talented, outstanding Chinese computer scientists and physicists and researchers. So it's, the U.S. and China have the two largest scientific establishments in the world. And if you look at almost any scientific paper, we were all reading a lot of these papers from journals like Nature and JAMA during COVID-19. And if you look at the authors of these papers, usually it's a very extensive collaboration, lots of names there, but on many, many papers, you have significant Chinese collaborators on these kind of scientific, leading scientific papers. So we have the Science and Technology Agreement between the U.S. and China was the very first agreement that was signed after normalization of relations in 1979 between the U.S. and China. And of course, the U.S. has had these exchanges going since then, and the technology flow has been very much in the direction of U.S. to China over the decades. That was really what Deng Xiaoping had in mind. He wanted to gain U.S. technology to try to modernize China's economy and build a modern state, and that was what reform and opening was all about. And the U.S. was, happy to do it at that time to help China that was, quite backward in terms of technology. But in recent decades, of course, that flow of technology from the U.S. to China has presented a competitive kind of challenge to the U.S. economy and to our innovation and our comparative advantage. And even more recently than that, the Chinese innovation sphere has become a kind of a technology powerhouse of its own, something that, on the U.S. side, we would look to learn from. And so the picture has changed on the Science and Technology Agreement, but I think it's still so important that we keep these connections between our researchers and our scientists, especially in basic science research, because as I said, we have the two most advanced and largest scientific establishments, and if we don't keep connections, we're going to lose so many opportunities for, making advancements in science that can really help humanity progress. I was recently at the 45th anniversary celebration of U.S. China diplomatic relations in Atlanta at the Carter Center. And the Carter Center has done a lot of work on, infectious disease and in Africa in particular. But one of the things that we were told there is that if the U.S. and China could collaborate in order to streamline the testing of new medicines. In other words, these trials of new drugs that are for things like combating cancer or combating Alzheimer's disease. If the trial periods could be consolidated and coordinated, that we could save, you could get drugs to market much, much faster and save millions of lives. And so that's the kind of thing that, seems like it shouldn't really be at the heart of some kind of competition. I mean, this is something that we really need to see as a global public good, as a good for humanity, just like efforts towards climate change, and try to work to take away obstacles here.
Thank you. Why doesn't the U.S. and China discuss the supply of goods from China to the U.S. consumers as a good thing? Case in point was the U.S. port slowdown that affected U.S. supply chain management to nearly zero.
Huh.
So
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of the things that definitely you can see in the wake of COVID-19 and maybe even in the wake of the global financial crisis, I'm not sure, is a loss of confidence, certainly in the U.S., in a lot of the developed world, and even outside of that, a loss of confidence in globalization and in sort of our own ability to continue to master globalization, if you will, or to compete in globalization. I think there's because certainly China's size is so large and it's such a manufacturing powerhouse. It kind of felt like China might overwhelm our economy and might, become the sole source of goods production. And I think that fear, which was not, played down at all by politicians in the United States or other countries, has really taken hold in the American imagination. And so thinking about, manufactured products coming in from China has become a real kind of red flag for people in the United States. And I think a lot of this is due to, kind of loss of confidence, as I said. Also, there's a lot of probably misinformation. But it is interesting that, even though Donald Trump, as part of that trade war, put a 20%, across the board tariff on many, many Chinese manufactured goods, that the trade has actually not really, significantly decreased. And one of the things that, is happening is that even if Chinese imports to the U.S. have decreased in the last couple of years, which they have, the products are still coming in. They're being routed in now through third countries. So the Chinese manufacturers are setting up shop in Vietnam to make things or to assemble things that come from China and then send them to the U.S. so they can avoid the tariffs that way. But it ends up to not really change the picture of how much is coming from China so much. It just increases the cost to Americans who are buying these products. So there are a lot of very complicated aspects to the U.S.-China trade picture. But I think one of the things that probably Americans are not really being given kind of accurate information about the dangers of the trade from China and also about the benefits of trade from China, or, in fact, how it's actually happening now, and whether or not anything's really changed except for the price of goods going higher. So, I think this is something that's going to be difficult to change in an election year because the narratives on globalization and trade are pretty baked in now to, I think, the American political sort of discussions and discourse. But I hope over time that, we would get back to a kind of a more reality-based discussion about how the global economy works, how trade works, what the benefits are. Because I think that the rise in protectionism, which may have more or less started maybe with China, but definitely amplified by the U.S. now, and it's being now repeated in many, many other countries. I think that we will come to see that as a negative over time and probably have to revisit and reverse a lot of it. So we'll see. But I think that the trade picture in between the U.S. and China should really be, we should have a trade negotiation going on with China. There are a lot of abuses in the trading system with China, and those need to be ironed out. And I think, we could do that through concerted negotiations. And as I mentioned, we had this phase one trade deal, even in the Trump administration. So there was an effort to negotiate with China on trade, even in that administration. And we should definitely be trying to do that now, I think.
Thank you. So we've discussed imports. Now let's go to the export equation. Many U.S. investors left China in recent years because of the political and economic reasons. What are your insights into how to rebuild their confidence to go back again to China, besides improving transparency in regulatory processes and intellectual property issues, a more predictable business environment reforms, any other challenges you see that are still major factors to be considered to increase their confidence in going back to China?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the most important thing is on the China side. The questioner asked, pointed to all the right issues on the China side. I think, um, and the Chinese have fallen down on a number of these areas in recent years, so they have a lot of work to do. I would say, transparency and sort of consistency in rules is one of the things. I mean, the rules and laws in China are applied extremely inconsistently, extremely arbitrarily, and that's been the case, unfortunately, even more in recent years with respect to business. We've seen real crackdown on the private sector, the Chinese private sector, which of course is the is the locus of all of the dynamism in the economy, the sort of growth and employment comes from the private sector, the growth in productivity and innovation comes from the private sector, but we've seen mysteriously the Chinese government sort of become skeptical of the private sector and has sort of clipped the wings of the private sector. I think COVID-19 has certainly contributed a lot to the general feeling of businesses that the government has become more arbitrary, if anything, and that was seen in the measures taken during COVID-19, which I think scared a lot of people. And certainly a lot of executives from Western companies left during COVID, and given the length of time that they had to be away because of the length of time that the pandemic was around and the lockdown measures continued, they haven't gone back. And so it's extremely difficult at this point, given the environment for business in China, to convince them to go back. And a lot of these companies, the ones that haven't left, the ones that have stayed, have turned to sort of hiring Chinese executives to run their businesses in China. So, I don't know if that will ever turn back to, having more expat managers in China. But it's still the climb out of COVID, I would say, in that respect. The other thing, other than sort of transparency, rules, the intellectual property protection that you mentioned, and some of the other things where, foreign companies have felt unfairly treated in China, in particular with regard to subsidies and having to have a joint venture partner and some of these other things. The U.S. Political environment for companies going to China has really also changed markedly, and companies are now sort of being targeted for their dealings with China, and I think that has really spooked a lot of U.S. companies and a lot of U.S. investors. And it's very popular now to say that China is uninvestable. I think it's uninvestable, or at least that term is used mostly from the perspective of things that China hasn't done. And in addition to the things we've mentioned with respect to foreign companies, I mean, China is just not moving out with its economic reform plans, and it's got a fairly confused picture about what the roadmap is going forward for economic policy, I think, in China, in terms of what kind of market openings they're going to be pursuing, what kind of support for private sector business they're going to be pursuing, what kind of tax regime they'll have, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of question marks there. But I think also on the U.S. side, a lot of companies are just waiting to see how things are going to shake out. And there's also a lot of uncertainty, as you mentioned, on the U.S. side with respect to the politics here and next year, and how China and China business will be perceived going forward. So I think, wait and see is kind of the watchword.
We have come to our time, but I'm going to ask you to answer one more question because this kind of sums up our discussion today. And I'm very apologetic to all that didn't get their questions answered. There's quite a stack here. What are some ways to incentivize Beijing to cooperate with Washington on specific policy issues like counterterrorism, climate change, and/or technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things that we talked about a lot during our trip to Beijing last week was the eruption of conflict in the Middle East, how it's in the interests of both the U.S. and China and the rest of the global community to try to curb the conflict there, especially keep it from escalating, to try to protect shipping in the Red Sea, to try to pursue some kind of a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, et cetera. And how could China be involved more actively in trying to get us to any of these places? And I think that the answer that was most frequently heard was, yes, all of that is in China's interest, but U.S.-China relations are so bad, and we consider the U.S. to be sort of the number one kind of hostile threat to our security that, it's very hard for us to make a move to try to cooperate with the U.S. when we think that, we're going to be a target. So I think for the Chinese, what they would say is that improvement in the U.S.-China relationship would be the best kind of way to sort of across the board improve prospects for cooperation between the U.S. and China. The U.S. has resisted that formula and said, well, this kind of cooperation is in China's interest, so China should do it. And, that's the line that the U.S. has taken on climate change as well. I think on climate change, which is the other clear area where, it's in everyone's interest for China to make improvements, what the approach has been of the Chinese government, as we saw sort of in the Sunnylands Declaration, is that they will take steps to move out on climate change measures, and they've just announced, I think today, again, more measures on decarbonization, but they're not going to do it in a way that the U.S. can sort of take credit for them making these moves. They're just not that interested in, until the relationship fundamentally improves, they're not that interested in signaling actively cooperation. They're more in the mode now of stabilization. I mean, I think that we should all hope that we get to the point where we could improve the relationship sufficiently to see some genuine cooperation, because there are a lot of problems out there in the world that would be helpful if we could get the U.S. and China kind of more actively looking for solutions together. But I don't think we're there at the moment, and we're probably going to have a hard time getting there this year. We'll see if, depending on the outcome of the U.S. election, it's possible that next year we could try to move in the direction of more kind of active cooperation on some of these things.
Okay, with that, we're going to close this session, but thank you so much for joining us today, Susan. That was a really wonderful discussion. Love your optimistic outlook. And thank you for showing us places where we will cooperate and have some progressive and positive interactions. So thanks everyone for coming, and I hope to see you again at another webinar soon. Take care.
Great. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.